And before we move to a broader discussion about military spending and the way it affects a country's economy, let's look back at that tally of U.S. military spending. Again, this tally began at the start of our segment just a few minutes ago, and already you can see the U.S. has spent more than $3 million, and it's counting, almost close to 4 now. A lot has been said and written about military spending, but Ian Morris has a unique perspective. He's the author of War, What Is It Good For? Conflict and the Progress of Civilization from Primates to Robots. He's also a professor at Stanford University, and he joins us from California. Thanks so much for joining us. Let's start with the title of your book, War, What Is It Good For? Many of us remember the Edwin Starr song. The lyrics continue with the 2 words, absolutely nothing. But you disagree. You argue that historically, war makes society safer and richer. How so?
Yeah, it's a very paradoxical argument to make, but I think if you look back across 15,000 years of history since the end of the last ice age, this is what we see, that the world has become a much safer place. It's sort of hard to believe that sometimes, but it's much safer than it used to be. And the big force making us safe has been the rise of organized societies with governments that can suppress violence within the state. But the one thing that's led to the creation of these states has actually been war and fighting. So it's a very paradoxical history. In a sense, you could say war and violence have slowly been putting themselves out of business across the last 15,000 years.
Interesting. Well, Ian, you just heard Jim's story. It talked about how the U.S. military has become the country's top employer. We know countries like China are increasing military spending as well. Your book looks back on this history, 15,000 years of war. Historically, how important is the military as far as providing jobs itself?
It varies a lot from time to time, place to place, but usually, since the rise of real states with proper governments, the military has been one of the biggest things they spend their money on. And so, like in the Roman Empire, the military was the biggest single employer in the empire. More than half of the empire's, the government's money went into paying for the army. And this sort of pattern that the army is there to protect the society, but it also becomes a major part of the economy of the society. This is not a new thing that America's invented. It goes back a really long way.
Certain technological advances developed for the military can sometimes be used by everyday consumers, kind of similar to space. We think about Velcro and Teflon. With the military, it's GPS for navigation, drones. How important are military programs in terms of driving technological innovation?
Yeah, I mean, if you were to ask, has the military been good for technology? I think the answer would have to be kind of yes, but. And it's easy to think of lots of ways in which war and military spending has driven technological progress, like, say, aviation during the First World War, radar, or medicine. A lot of medical advances made because of military spending. So there are lots and lots of ways in which military spending has pushed technology forward. But the but part of the answer is if you think, well, okay, all this money, I mean, you've got this counter going, $1 million a minute spent by the US military. What would we get if we took all that money and spent it on something else? And so economists will often ask, well, what if we took the money that we got spending on the military, if we spent it on education, say, or building new roads or new bridges? Maybe that would have given an even bigger boost to the economy. So it's very hard to say. It's easy to think of the examples of new developments that military spending has produced, but then it's easy to think of ways in which maybe we would be better off if we'd not done this.
You've been thinking about this and researching it quite a bit. As you started to look at this, what were some of the things that jumped out at you and surprised you?
Well, things about the patterns of military spending, I guess, would be how much it's changed over history. Like, say, you've got this clock going counting US military spending. The numbers are just mind-boggling. As I speak, millions more dollars are being spent. And yet, I mean, one of the weird things is that compared to most periods in history, what we spend now, like as a percentage of our economy, it's much smaller than it usually has been in the past. And it's kind of a rule of thumb, historians will say, that if a country spends more than about 5% of its income on warfare, on the military, it's heading for disaster. But even though countries like the US and China spend these just astronomical amounts of money on their militaries, we're well below this danger level. So in some ways, it's this weird situation. The amount getting spent goes up and up, but so long as the economy keeps growing faster, overall, we're spending a smaller proportion of our wealth on warfare.
Forecast the future for us. What's the end game?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I would be very rich and famous by now. I mean, I think there's many possibilities. I think I would say there's sort of two big trends that I see playing out in the 21st century. And one of them, I would say, is toward a more and more fragmented world. We've been living for 25 plus years in a world where the US has really dominated international politics in a way that there's never been anything quite like that before. And the result has been that governments have been very hesitant about going to war. They don't want to do anything using force unless they kind of get American clearance first. And this, I think, has had a lot to do with lowering the number of wars being fought in the world. There's, so far as we know, never been this few wars being fought. So I think this is one big trend toward an increasingly dangerous world as this sort of international stability and order begins to break up. But then it's balanced out by another trend toward more and more institutions, more and more technology that links people together and makes war seem like an increasingly stupid way to try to solve our conflicts. So I guess rather than giving you a single prediction for the 21st century, I would say we're going to see a kind of race between these two trends. The global order breaking down, more and more flashpoints, more and more danger of a major war, while at the same time we're being pulled the other way by new kinds of international institutions and new technological developments.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. Ian Morse, thanks again for talking to us. Appreciate it.